Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we are studying Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 39. Even though I've written here 38, that was my mistake. We're learning Daf Lamed Tes. So at the beginning of the Daf, we wrap up our discussions of Rav's opinion regarding Eruv when you have Yom Tov and Shabbos connected. Then we talk about 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and why that may or may not be different than other Yom Tovs of Galios. And then we talk about other Yom Tovs of Galios a little bit and the opinion of the Chachamim and Reb Yossi. So that is what's on the agenda for today. However, let us begin on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. So we are in the middle of the discussion of Rav's opinion, right? So Rav had said that the halacha is like these 4 elders, like these 4 rabbis, and these Daled Zakenim, that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, that when it comes to Yom Tov and Shabbos that are one after the other, we treat them as Beis Kedushos, 2 separate Kedushas, and therefore you can put out an Eruv on one day and a separate Eruv for the next day and split them up. Cool. So then we got into this whole discussion. Rav Chisda had asked, but if that's the case, then how does it fit in with Rav's opinion, which is by Beitza Shnolda B'Yom Tov, that if you have an egg that's laid on day 1, you're not allowed to eat it on day 2, but if there are 2 separate Kedushas, why not? Rav said it's an issue of Achana, and we got back and forth into all these things about if it's Achana, then how do you understand the Mishnah when it comes to Eruv, that it says we could put it out in advance, and we got into a whole long discussion. But at the end, what we said, the last thing that we said was that when it comes to Eruv, so when you lay out your Eruv, let's say you go to the end of the Tchum, and you just kind of wait there until either Shabbos begins or Yom Tov begins. So in that case, you're not saying anything. Because if you're saying anything, you'd have to say something in advance before Shabbos or Yom Tov actually starts, and that would be Achana. So, however, you don't have to say anything. You can just kind of wait there until Shabbos or Yom Tov begins, and then that is how your Eruv Tchumen will work. And we're saying because you're not saying anything, so then, it's not like you're doing any Achana before Shabbos or Yom Tov begins. But if you say something, so then that would be considered Achana. So, in that vein, the Gemara asks, Amalei, Rabbi Bar of Chanan Abaye. So Rabbi Bar of Chanan asks Abaye. Now we saw Rabbi Bar of Chanan and Abaye in Masechta Shabbos and Daf Kuf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. Right, Abaye had asked Rabba. He said, Rabba, who's gonna what's that called? Eulogize you, because everybody here in Pumbedisa hates you, because you're always giving them musar. So Rabba said, you, Abaye, and Rabbi Bar of Chanan will eulogize me. So Rabbi Bar of Chanan says to Abaye, so if Rabba, our teacher, would have heard the following brisa, Hadatanya, that which we learn in a brisa, Lo yahalech adam l'sof sadeu leida ma'itzricha, that a person on Shabbos should not go out to the end of his field to take notes, to take mental notes, so that he could see what the field needs. Kayotzebo, and similarly, Lo yitayel adam al pesach medina k'dei she'yikanis lemerchatz miyad. Person should not go to the end of his state, I guess, the end of where he lives, as far as he can travel, so that as soon as Shabbos is over, he can go to the bathhouse. So now, if only Rabbi would have known about this brisa, then he would have retracted on his statement that as long as somebody goes out to where his Tchum Shabbos is going to be, and he just stays quiet and just hangs out there until Shabbos or Yom Tov begins, that will be a good Eruv Tchumen. Now, the thing is, we see from this brisa that you're not allowed to go to your field and just kind of take mental notes, or you're not allowed to just go hang out by the end of the Medina so that you can get to the bathhouse right away. Now, over there you're not saying anything, over there you're not doing anything, you're just walking, and we see that it's a problem. So therefore, if only Rabbi would have known of this brisa, he would not have said that when it comes to Tchum Shabbos, as long as you can hang out there and you can go over there, as long as you don't say anything, it's fine. But we see that just going somewhere is a problem. So the Gemara says, Velohi. That's not actually true. Shmiele v'lo hadarbe. Rabba knew about this brisa, and it didn't have any effect on his opinion vis-a-vis with regard to Erev. How come? Because Hasam muchacha milsa hachalav muchacha milsa. Because when it comes to somebody who's going to his field and he's looking around and he's taking mental notes, it's obvious what he's doing. He's being mechin for the weekday. Obviously, he's going to take mental notes so that he could figure out what he needs to do in his field. Or, if he's going out over there to the end of as far as he can go, so he can get as close to the bathhouse as he can, also his intentions are clear that he's being mechin for something for after Shabbos. However, in this case, when he's walking to the edge of the tchum by himself, if he's a Talmid Chacham, we'll say, okay, he's deep in his studies, and he's thinking, and if he's an Am Ha'aretz, if he's not a Talmid Chacham, then we'll think, okay, what's he doing out there? Okay, somebody lost a donkey or something, he needs to get it, right? It's not clear that his intention is for some weekday kind of activity. It's just a guy who's walking outside of his city. So therefore, in that case, it would be acceptable. You could do that as an Erev, and it's not an issue of Hachana. Gufa, we'd said earlier, yesterday, Amar Rav Yehuda, said Rav Yehuda, Erev biraglav biyom rishon, my biraglav basheni. So if on day one he made an Erev biraglav, he could do the same thing in Yom Sheni. What does that mean? It means that if, let's say, we have Yom Tiv on Friday, followed by Shabbos, so then, if on Thursday, before Yom Tov started on Friday, he walks out to the Tchum, and then hangs out there until Yom Tov starts, he can do the same thing on Friday. He can go to the Tchum and hang out until Shabbos starts, and like that he will set up his Tchum on both of the days. Fine. If on Thursday he went out, or really sent a shliach to go out to 2,000 amas away and put out some bread, so he can do the same thing on Friday, right? If he did that, if he sent a shliach on Thursday, he could send a shliach on Friday with that bread. Fine. Erev b'pas barishon my braglav basheni. If on Thursday he sent out a messenger to make an erev for him with bread, well, he can go himself on Friday and hang out there until Shabbos begins. But if on Thursday he made his Erev by walking out to this location and just hanging out over there, do not on Friday take a bread and walk out to the wherever you want to make your Tchum, wherever you want to make your Shabbos, and hang out there with bread if you didn't already do that on Thursday. Because we do not, make an Erev for the first time on Yom Tov. You would have to do, if you had this bread, and already on Thursday before Yom Tov started, you walked out with this bread, so you can walk out with that bread also on Friday to make your Erev for Shabbos. However, if on Thursday you made your Erev by just walking to the location, then you can't make an Erev now on Friday, on Yom Tov for Shabbos, because that would be like Hachana, that you're preparing for Yom Tov to Shabbos, right, for like the first time. Erev b'pas b'yom rishon, my b'pas b'yom sheni. If you made a Erev with bread on Thursday for Yom Tov on Friday, so then you can use that same bread to make your Erev on Friday for Shabbos. As Shmuel says, Amar Shmuel v'osa pas, right? Shmuel clarifies for us that when the Brisa is talking about making an Erev with bread for 2 days, it means the same exact loaf, because then that was already prepared before Yom Tov to be for your Erev. However, to not take a loaf of bread and, make it on Yom Tov, on Friday, say this is going to be my Erev for Shabbos, because we don't do that milichatchila on Yom Tov to make this bread for your Erev, because it would be hachana. But if you already prepared it before Yom Tov, that would be acceptable, and then you can reuse it on Friday. Fine. Rav Ashi said, Dekanami masnisin, you can also infer this from our Mishnah, Dekatani, that it says, Ketzad u'ose, how do you make your Erev molicho barishon umachshich olav, v'not lo uvalo, that he takes his bread, and on the first day, so on Thursday, he goes to where he's going to make his Eruv, and he hangs out there, v'not lo uvalo, and then he takes it home with him, so that it doesn't get eaten or anything. And then on the second day, on Friday, when he goes to make his Eruv for Shabbos, he takes back that same bread. And then, once Shabbos begins, he can eat it. He can't take it back with him because he can't carry the bread on Shabbos, but he eats it if he wants, and then he can go home. So we see that even our Mishnah can infer that we're talking about the same bread, but you wouldn't take a new bread on Yom Tiv to make a Eruv for Shabbos. V'Rabbanan and Abaye and Rabbi Bar Chanan, who were kind of arguing on Rabbi earlier, right? Rabbi had said that there's an issue with a Chana from Yom Tiv to Shabbos, right? So, and Rabbi Bar Chanan and Abaye were like asking kashas on Rabbi. Sounds like they wouldn't necessarily have an issue with using a bread milichatchila on Yom Tiv, a new bread that you didn't prepare from before Yom Tiv. So then what do they do with our Mishnah, which implies they're using the same bread for both days? Maybe our Mishnah is just giving good advice that if you want, you can use the same bread, but you don't have to. Okay, fine. New Mishnah. Now this Mishnah is talking about Rosh Hashanah. And what becomes interesting now is that we're talking about 2 days of Yom Tiv, meaning up until now, we were talking about where there was Yom Tiv on Friday, let's say, and Shabbat, and followed by Shabbos. So those are obviously 2 days, 2 Kedushos, right? The question is, do we view it as one long day? Do we view it as 2 separate days? Beseder, but they're two, both of them are certainly, a holy day. Whether it's Yom Tiv, whether it's Shabbos. Now we're going to start talking about when we have 2 days of Yom Tiv, and is it out of suffix? Maybe it's not a suffix. We have to, so that already becomes more interesting because potentially one day isn't actually kadosh at all. Maybe one day is completely a weekday. So here we go, moving on to Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda Rosh Hashanah, Shayayare Shema Tisaber. So what if it's Rosh Hashanah and he didn't know maybe it was going to be a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, right? Because back in the day, the way, right now we have a fixed calendar, we know everything in advance. But once upon a time, you wouldn't know if, let's say, Elul was going to be a 30-day Elul or a 29-day Elul. Depends if witnesses come to the Beis Din in Yerushalayim and say that and testify that they saw a new moon. If witnesses come and testify, we saw a new moon, so then that means that day 30 is already the first day of Tishrei, which means that it's Rosh Hashanah. But if no witnesses come to testify that they saw the new moon, so then Memela, day 30 isn't yet the new month and it's part of Elul, in which case it is not Rosh Hashanah, and the next day is going to be Rosh Hashanah. But out of Safek, they would keep both days as Rosh Hashanah, right? Because they don't know if the witnesses are going to come, if they're not going to come. So therefore they would keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So he says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rosh Hashanah. So says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rosh Hashanah Shayari Shem Tisaber. So you have Rosh Hashanah. Now you have a guy. Again, he lives in city B, and there's city A to his left and city C to his right. Now he knows that on day 1 of what would be Rosh Hashanah, he's got to go right to city C. But he also knows that the following day, he's got to go left to city A. Okay? Now, he doesn't want to risk that what if no witnesses come on day 30 of Elul, in which case, Rosh Hashanah is going to Memela be on the second day, meaning you'll end up having to keep both days out of Safek because you don't know on the first day if anybody's going to end up coming, so you end up keeping Rosh Hashanah the first day, but when nobody ends up coming, so then you keep it the second day for the second day as well. So it ends up being 2 days. Now how's he going to get to city A on day 2 when it's still Yom Tiv? So what he does is, out of Safek, he sets up both of the Eruvs in advance. He sets up the Eruv to get right to city C, and he sets up the Eruv also to the left, so that in the following day he can get to city A. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Omer says Rabbi Yehuda, and obviously if it ends up that the witnesses come on day 30, which means that there was only 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, so then 2 days later, it's no longer Rosh Hashanah, and he can go to city A as much as he wants. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer says Rabbi Yehuda, Rosh Hashanah Shayari Shema Tisaber. If you have Rosh Hashanah and you have a fellow that on day 1 he needs to get to city C, on day B on day 2 he needs to get to city A. So if he's concerned that what if Rosh Hashanah is going to end up being 2 days, so ma'ariv adam shnei Ayruvin, so he can make 2 Eiruvs in advance. V'omer Ayruvi barishon l'mizrach v'sheni l'ma'ariv, says, look, on day 1, I want my Eruv to be the one to the east so that I can get to city C. And I want that on day 2, my Eruv should be to the west so that I can get to city A. Barishon l'ma'ariv v'sheni l'mizrach, or you can reverse it. Say, look, I want that on day 1, my Eruv should be the one to the west. And on day 2, it should be the one to the east. Eruvi barishon v'sheni kivnei iri. He could say, look, I'm only interested in having an Eruv on day 1, but on day 2, I want to be just in my house. Or you could say, I want my Eruv to be on day 2, and on day 1 I'm home. The Chachamim do not agree with Rabbi Yehuda. They say you have to make up your mind, and you can't treat them as 2 separate Kedushos and make 2 separate Eruvs. You only have 1 shot. Okay? V'odam Rabbi Yehuda, and more so Rabbi Yehuda said, Masne Adam ala kalkale b'yom tiv rishin v'ochla b'sheni. Okay? So Rabbi Yehuda also says that if you have 2 baskets of tevel, you have 2 baskets of tevel, okay, and you also have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, okay, so what you can do is, on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah, you can take one of those baskets and say, okay, this is going to be Truma, okay, and you also say, look, if today is a weekday, so then I'm allowed to separate Truma on a weekday, and this is Mama's Truma, and the other basket is Chulin, and that's that. And then he puts it away. And then the next day, he comes back, and he does the same thing. He goes to that basket that he made Truma the previous day, and he says, look, if today is a weekday, i.e. and yesterday was Rosh Hashanah, so then today I'm making this basket Truma, and then he can eat it on day 2. Right? Because Miman Avshach, one of the days was not Rosh Hashanah, and on that day he was allowed to separate Truma. So by day 2 already, the Truma that he had separated yesterday and also today is certainly at this point going to be Truma, and the rest of it is going to be Chulin, and he can eat that Chulin. And similarly, if you have an egg born on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah, Memela you can eat it on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah, because again, if day 1 was a weekday, well then it was born on a weekday, certainly you can eat it on day 2, which is Rosh Hashanah, or if day 1 was Rosh Hashanah, well then then day 2 is a weekday, and you can eat that egg. So either way, there's no problem. The Chacham do not agree with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas Omer, however, l'fnei hateva b'yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah, somebody who's the shliach tzibor on Rosh Hashanah, Omer achlitzenu Hashem Elokeinu es yom Rosh Chodesh hazeh mayom im lemachar. And he says, Zarzenu, says Rashi, like make us what's Zerizus? I don't know, fastidious, whatever. Help us out over here on this day of Rosh Chodesh, meaning it's Rosh Hashanah. And according to Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinos, so he's saying 2 interesting things. One is that he's mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah, that in addition to mentioning Rosh Hashanah, you also mention the fact that it's Rosh Chodesh. And interesting thing number 2 is that he's making this like Tanai kind of thing, this condition, right? Im hayom im lemachar. It says, look, I don't really know if today is Rosh Hashanah or if tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah. It depends on if the witnesses come and testify. U'lemachar hu omer, and then the next day he says, Im hayom im emesh, right? That whether today is Rosh Hashanah or maybe yesterday was Rosh Hashanah, I don't know. Right? And because really only in Yerushalayim they could know if the witnesses came. Everywhere outside of Yerushalayim they don't know if witnesses came or not. So they keep 2 days of Yom Tiv, of Rosh Hashanah, out of Safek. The Chacham didn't admit to him. And we'll have to see in the Gemara what it means that they didn't admit to Reb Dosa. Do they disagree in that they say that you don't mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? Maybe they disagree and they say, well, while you mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah, you don't do this whole Tanai thing. We'll have to see exactly what they didn't agree with. Says the Gemara, Man lo hodu lo chacham, man lo hodu lo. So the Gemara says, when the Mishnah says that Rabbi Yehuda says that on Rosh Hashanah you can make an Eruv for each of the 2 days separately, and it says that the Chacham disagreed. Who were these Chacham? Amarav Rabbi Yossi. Rav says it's Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi felt that you cannot treat these 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as two separate Kedushos. You have to treat them as one Kedusha. And we'll have to understand why. The Tanyas we learn in the Brayso Modim, Chachamim, Rabbi Eliezer, that the Chachamim admit to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said that we treat, when you have, let's say, Yom Tov followed by Shabbos, you treat them as two Kedushos, and the Chachamim didn't agree with Rabbi Eliezer, but they do nonetheless agree with Rabbi Eliezer, B'Rosh Hashanah. She'yari Shemitis Aber. But they do agree with Rabbi Eliezer that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, and it's 2 days of Yom Tov, and they're assuming that it's out of Suffolk because he's concerned Shemitis Aber, that maybe Elul will end up being a 30-day Elul, which means that only on the second day would it be Rosh Hashanah. So we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah out of Suffolk. Ma'ariv Adam Shnei Ayruvin. In that case, a person can lay out 2 Eiruvs in advance. V'omer Ayruvi Barishon Lemizrach Uvasheni Lemarav. And you could say that on day 1 of Rosh Hashanah, I want to take advantage of my Eyruv. I want to use my Eyruv in the east. And then on day 2, I want to use my Eyruv in the west. Barishon Lemarav Uvasheni Lemizrach. On day 1, I want to use my Eyruv in the west. On day 2, I want to use my Eyruv in the east. I mean, you could say either of those two. Eruvi Barishon Basheni Kibnei Iri. I only want to use an Eruv on day 1, but on day 2 I want to be like everybody else and I want to stay home. Eruvi Bashenu Barishon Kibnei Iri. Or you could say, look, I want my Eruv I only care about the Eruv on day 2, but on day 1 I want to be home. Rabbi Yossi Oser, whereas Rabbi Yossi says he's not allowed to. So the Chachamim are saying, so the rabbis in general, even though they argue with Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to Yom Tov followed by Shabbos, but when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, which is 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, and they're assuming that they're understanding that the issue is that it's Pashat Suffolk. We're not sure which day is actually Rosh Hashanah, so therefore we keep 2 days. But one of them is going to Memela be a weekday, and one of them is going to be Rosh Hashanah. We don't know which one's which, and we can treat them as 2 separate Kedushos. It's not a 2-day Yom Tov. It's 2 individual days that we're acting as though we're Yom Tov because we're not sure which is which. But you can create 2 separate Eiruvs. We can treat them as 2 separate Kedushos. You can have an Eruv on one day and a different Eruv on the other day. No problem. Now Rabbi Yossi, however, says that it's not allowed. You can't do that. You have to make up your mind. You can only have one Eruv for both days because he treats Rosh Hashanah as one Kedusha. And the question is, why does Rabbi Yossi treat it as one Kedusha? Isn't it a Suffolk Yom? Right? We're not sure which one's which. So Amar Len Rabbi Yossi says to the rabbis, Iyatem Modim, don't you admit, Shimbo Edim min Mincha Ulamaila Shnagin Oso Ayom Kodesh and Machar Kodesh? Okay, listen to this. This is interesting. Rabbi Yossi is pointing out that there could actually be a situation where the 2 days that we're keeping as Rosh Hashanah, both of them are actually Kodesh. Both of them are actually Mamish Yom Tov. What does that mean? So, first of all, it is up to Bezdin to decide when Rosh Chodesh is. It's not up to God, right? Meaning certain things God determines, certain things God leaves up to us to determine. One of those things are to decide the months, to decide when the holidays fall out. It is 100% in the hands of Bezdin. Now, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, so what happens? So you already had 29 days of Elul. Now it comes to day 30. Day 30 is the big fat question mark. Because what happens is, everybody wakes up on day 30, and they don't yet know if today is Rosh Hashanah or not. It literally depends if witnesses are going to show up. So, what happens is, in the Beis HaMikdash, they wake up on day 30 of Elul, and the Kohanim, they offer their korbanos, the korban tamid shel shachar, the morning korbanos, assuming that it's a weekday. They have no indication that today is Rosh Hashanah. Now, if, let's say at 10 in the morning, these witnesses come and testify that they saw the new moon and their testimony is accepted, at that point, Bezdin will say, okay, well, we have testimony. Today is Rosh Hashanah, and they may establish the new month on that day, day 30, and it turns out retroactively that that day is Rosh Hashanah. And then when it comes to the Talmud Shalbeinu Arbaim, when it comes to the afternoon sacrifices, already the Kohanim know that today is Rosh Hashanah, and they offer whatever Musaf offerings they need to offer, whatever offerings they'll do for Rosh Hashanah. At that point, they already assume it's Rosh Hashanah. And in that case, so then Rosh Hashanah is on day 30 of Elul, and the next day is just a regular weekday. And what's interesting about that is that we didn't actually know that it was Rosh Hashanah until the middle of the day. But the fact of the matter is, the witnesses come, say they saw the moon, that makes day 30 Rosh Hashanah. Okay, fine. And then the following day is just a regular weekday. What if no witnesses came the entire day? So then Mele, day 30 was not Rosh Hashanah. And if day 30 was not Rosh Hashanah, then automatically by default, the following day is going to be Rosh Hashanah. And Elul ended up being 30 days. And then the following day on day 31 will be day 1 of Tishrei, and that will be Rosh Hashanah. Now, all day on day 30, you didn't do any malacha the whole day because you weren't sure if witnesses were going to come, and it'll turn out that today's Rosh Hashanah. So you kind of treat both days as if they're Rosh Hashanah, and you can't do any malacha. But if the witnesses come on the day 30, and it turns out day 30 is Rosh Hashanah, so then already then the next day certainly is a weekday in all ways. Now, here's where things get interesting. What happens if day 30 comes, and the Kohanim wake up in the morning, there's no witnesses, so they bring the Tamid Shel Shachar, assuming it's a weekday. No witnesses come the entire day. As we know from Masechta Brachos, at 9.5 hours into the day, the Kohanim offer the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. We also know that after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, you don't offer any more Karbanos. So, basically, the Kohanim finished up their work in the Beis HaMikdash. It's 9.5 hours into a 12-hour day, and all the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash is done. Now the witnesses come. The witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. The afternoon offering is already offered, and they say, "Look, we saw the moon," and their testimony, after interrogation, their testimony is accepted. So now what do? On the one hand, day 30 was really Rosh Hashanah, right? Yet they have testimony that day 30 is Rosh Hashanah. Now, on the other hand, it's kind of lame. I mean, they already offered all of the korbanos. You can't offer the korban musaf of Rosh Hashanah anymore. You know, so on the one hand, you have testimony that today was Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, there's nothing you can really do about it. You can't offer any Rosh Hashanah offerings. You can't do, literally, it's like Rosh Hashanah is going to come and go without having done anything to indicate that it's Rosh Hashanah. So it's kind of lame. So says Rabbi Yossi, in that case, what happens is, the Chachamim decide, well, the Bezdin decides, we're not going to declare today as Rosh Hashanah, because then we'll miss out on doing anything at all that's Rosh Hashanah-y. So we're going to declare tomorrow as Rosh Hashanah. But at the same time, we don't want to just say, okay, well, everybody, tomorrow's Rosh Hashanah, today you can go home and watch television, even though you've been, treating the entire day and not doing any malacha or anything like that. So what they do is, they actually make both days Kodesh. That is what the rabbis do. That's what the Bezdin does. In this case, when the witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim has already been offered, they end up saying that both days are actually Rosh Hashanah, right? It's not that one day is not and one day is. There's a suffix. It could actually be that if the witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, the Bezdin is actually going to say in that case that both days are actually Rosh Hashanah, and therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, out of concern for the situation where the witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim has already been offered, and the Bezdin actually says that both days are going to be Rosh Hashanah. So in that case, since we have to be concerned that maybe that's what happened that year, and there's actually mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, not just because we're not sure which day is actually Rosh Hashanah, but both days were actually determined to be Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, that you can't treat them as Beis Kedushos. You can't treat the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as 2 separate Kedushos and you can use 2 Erevs. No, we have to be concerned that maybe it's a year where both days are actually Rosh Hashanah and it's 1 Kedusha, and therefore you can only make 1 Erev. Wow. Okay. V'Rabbanan, the rabbis respond to Rabbi Yossi and they say, Hasum ke'echid zazulebe. And the Chachamim say, no, Rabbi Yossi, there's no such thing as having 2 days of Rosh Hashanah that the Bezdin is going to say that there's mamish 2 days of Kedusha. No. When the witnesses come after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim has already been offered, and the Bezdin says, okay, we're going to make tomorrow Rosh Hashanah, so that's it. Tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah. Today is not Rosh Hashanah, because they're waiting to declare Rosh Hashanah until tomorrow. But at the same time, they are going to say, don't go home and watch television, because they're concerned that what'll happen the next year? The next year, everyone's going to say, oh yeah, remember last year we didn't do Malacha the whole day, and then the witnesses ended up coming, and then the Chachamim said that it's not Rosh Hashanah, and at the end of the day we were able to go home and do Malacha. So then the next year, they're going to end up not taking it seriously, and they're going to do malacha already before the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim is offered. And then what will end up happening is if witnesses come at that point, before the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim is offered, well then mamish will be Rosh Hashanah, and they already did malacha on that day. So because we want to make sure that people will still take things seriously the next year and not remember, that the previous year they didn't do malacha the whole day, and then at the end the Bezdin ended up saying that it's just a regular day and you can do whatever you want. Tomorrow will be Rosh Hashanah. So to prevent a situation like that, then the Bezdin still says, look, even when the witnesses come after Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim, still don't do malacha the rest of the day. But it's not because they say that there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah this year. No, it's just that they said, look, there's 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, it's on the following day, but still just don't do any malacha on the first day, so that people won't, take the first day lightly. However, the fact of the matter is that there's only 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, and the other day Memela wouldn't be Rosh Hashanah, and you can treat them as 2 separate Kedushos, and you can lay out your Eruv, 2 Eruvs for each day of Rosh Hashanah respectively. Okay, now says the Gemara. So Rabbi Yehuda had given 3 examples in our Mishnah of things from different suffix of Rosh Hashanah, right? Number 1 was that you can live out 2 Eruvs. Number 2 was that you could make, set aside Truma on both days, and then Memela on day 2 you can eat it. And situation 3 was that an egg that's born on 1 day of Rosh Hashanah you can Memela eat on the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara is going to explain why we need all 3 of those examples. We need all 3 examples, the Ashma'in and Rosh Hashanah, because if we would only have the example of setting out your Eruv for Rosh Hashanah, B'hakam Rabbi Yehuda, that is where Rabbi Yehuda says that you can have 2 Eruvs. Mishum deloka avid midi, because you're not actually doing anything. Everything that you did in advance. You did before Yom Tov. But when it comes to setting aside Truma, where you're actually mamish doing something, so I might think that would not be acceptable. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda had to point out that you can even separate Trumas on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah under the, depending under the condition that maybe it's Yom Tov, maybe it's not. And if he would have only mentioned Truma and Eruv, Mishum deleka lemigzar alai, because there's no kind of gezerah that we can make to argue that they shouldn't be allowed. Aval beitza deika lemigzar ba mishum peres anoshrin or mishum mashkin shezavu emamodu l'rabanan tzricha. However, when it comes to an egg that's laid on day 1, so you might think to make a gezerah because of, for example, fruits that fall off a tree. We say that you can't eat them because you might end up then picking the fruits off mamash off the tree, or we say that you can't drink juice that came out of grapes, let's say, on their own. You still can't drink that because we're concerned that you might end up squeezing the grapes. So, because in those are cases of, extracting something from its source, a fruit from its tree, juice from a fruit, and we say that that's not allowed. So I might think that also for the same reason, an egg that was laid on day 1 shouldn't be allowed to be eaten on day 2. So, tzricha, therefore we needed Rabbi Yehuda to give all 3 examples and say that in all 3 cases you can, you can make the Eruv for 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. You can also set aside Truma and eat it on day 2, and also by the egg you can eat that on day 2 as well. Tanya, we learn in the Brisa, Ketzad Amar Rabbi Yehuda Masna Adam al Akalkala B'Yom Tov Rishon V'Ochel B'Sheni. So when Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah that a person can make a tanai on a basket of fruits on Yom Tov on the first day of Rosh Hashanah and eat it on the 2nd day, what exactly does that look like? So this is what it looks like. If you have a fellow, and in front of him are 2 baskets filled up to the brim with tevel, sweet. Omer, he says, Ima Yom Chol, if today is a weekday, Ulamachar Kodesh, and tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah, Teizo Truma Zo. Well then, I want one of these baskets, let's say the basket to the right, this is going to be Truma. And the basket to the left is going to be Chulin. Okay, fine. Vima Yom Kodesh, Ulamachar Chol, and if today is Rosh Hashanah, and tomorrow is the weekday, well then, Emidvar Klum, I didn't say anything. V'korya le'Hashem manicha. Okay, and then he says, okay, basket to the right, you are the one that I set aside as Truma, and that is that, and he leaves it, he puts it aside and goes on with his life. Ulamachar, and then the next day, Hu Omer, he says, Im Chol, if today is a weekday, Tezo Truma Zo. So then he goes, he says, look, basket on the right. If today is the weekday, well then I'm setting you aside now. Im Kodesh, and if today is Rosh Hashanah, well Im Dvar Klum, I didn't say anything. V'Korei Le Hashem, and then he says, okay, basket to the right, you are my truma. V'Ochla, now you can eat it. Because, Mimanafshach, if yesterday was the weekday, so he set it aside yesterday as truma. If today is the weekday, so he's setting it aside today. And either way, the basket to the left is now chulin, and he can eat the basket to the left. Rabbi Yossi says you can't do that for the same reason that we described earlier, that he's concerned that both days of Rosh Hashanah are mamish Rosh Hashanah, because what if the witnesses showed up in the Beis HaMikdash after the Talmud Rabbeinu Arbaim? Fine. And similarly, Rabbi Yossi would say that this is not allowed even when it comes to the 2 days of Yom Tov Shel Galios. Now the assumption right now is that what Rabbi Yossi is saying is, like, for example, even by the first 2 days of Pesach, let's say, that in Israel it's 1 day, and in Galos, outside of Israel, it's going to be 2 days. So there it's mamish out of Suffolk. There's no question that both of them are going to be Yom Tov. No, one of them is going to be Yom Tov, one of them isn't. And for some reason we're assuming that Rabbi Yossi says that we still have to be stringent there as well. We're going to discuss if that's really Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Hahu bar Tavia, there was a deer, the asa levei reish gelusa, that came to the reish gelusa, the itzid biyom tiv rishon shel galios, that it was trapped on day 1 of Yom Tov Rishon Shel Galios. So let's say it was Pesach, so they were keeping 2 days of Yom Tov of Pesach, because out of Sveika the Yom, we're not sure which day is Yom Tov. So now on day 1 of Yom Tov, this deer was trapped by non-Jewish people. And then it was shechted on day 2 of Yom Tov. Okay. Rav Nachman Rav Chizda achlu, Rav Sheshes lo achal. So Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda ate the meat, and Rav Sheshes would not eat the meat. So now Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda, they ate the meat because why not eat the meat, right? If yesterday was a weekday when the deer was trapped, so then what's the big deal? It was trapped on a weekday, it was shechted on Yom Tov, but you're allowed to shecht an animal on Yom Tov, so why can't we eat the meat? And even if yesterday was Yom Tov, so it was trapped by the non-Jews on Yom Tov, but today is a weekday, so as long we just have to wait enough time that we could have trapped it. But once, b'chdei she'eh also, as we learned in Masechta Shabbos, so long as we wait enough time that we could have done it ourselves. So now it's a weekday, and we can shecht and eat this animal. So Mimanav Shach, Reb Nachman and Rav Chizda reasoned that they would be able to eat this deer. So now, Amar Rav Nachman, my Ivid later Rav Sheshes, the Lochil Bisur the Tavia. Nachman says, what are we going to do about Rav Sheshes that he doesn't eat deer meat? Amar Rav Sheshes, ve'ehechi eichel. Rav Sheshes says, how can I possibly eat this deer meat? The Tani Isi, because Isi taught, v'amila Isi Tani, some say, okay, Isi taught. V'chena Rabbi Yossi also b'shnei Yom Tovim shel Galios. That Rabbi Yossi also said it was aser, that he, on both days of Yom Tov Sheni shel Galios. I.e., even here, let's say it's Pesach, and we have 2 days of Yom Tov because of Sveika Diyoma. Rabbi Yossi still said that you're not allowed to, you have to assume that you can't just assume that 1 day is Chol and 1 day is Kodesh. Rather, you have to treat them as one Kedusha, and therefore, you can't, I'm not going to eat this deer until after both days of Yom Tov are over. And we learned on Daf Yudal and Rabbeis that Rabbi Yossi is Nemuko Biyado, right? That he was, if he had his opinion, it was very well researched and very well backed, and therefore if Rabbi Yossi said something, you have to take it seriously. Okay, fine. But now the question is, did Rabbi Yossi really say that though? Did Rabbi Yossi really say that, apply the stringencies that he had by Rosh Hashanah, which is, based on, solid reasoning, which is that you could actually have a situation, according to Rabbi Yossi, where both days are Kodesh. But is that really the case by something like Pesach, where it's literally we're not sure which day is the 15th of Nisan, so therefore we keep 2 days to be sure. But one of them is certainly the 15th and one of them isn't. So Amarava Umay Kusha, Rava says, what is the question of Rav Sheshes? Dilma Achi Ka'amar, maybe this is what the Brisa is saying about Rabbi Yossi, that B'chena Rabbi Yossi Oser B'shnei Yom Tiv Shoresh Hashanah Bagola. That maybe what the Brisa was saying is that Rabbi Yossi would say that these stringencies apply on the 2 days of Yom Tiv of Rosh Hashanah Bagola, right? That Kilu outside of Israel on Rosh Hashanah, because they don't know when the witnesses came. So he would say you have to treat them both days as though it was Mamish Rosh Hashanah. But that wouldn't necessarily apply to other days of, the 2 days of Yom Tiv, like Pesach or Sukkot or Shavuos. So the Gemara says, yeah, but Rava, you can't say that, because it doesn't say Bagola in that price. It says Shalgalios, which implies Yom Tov Sheni Shalgalios, which is not Rosh Hashanah. It's talking about Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot. When we keep 2 days out of Suffolk, which one is the 15th, or and Shavuos would be which one's the 6th day of Sivan. Amar Rav Asi Umay Kusha, but Rav Asi has a different approach. Maybe you could say Dilma Achi Kamar. Maybe this is what the Brisa is saying. V'chein Hayir Rabbi Yossi Ose Isser Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Galios. That similarly Rabbi Yossi would approach the 2 days of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galios, right? The 2 days of Yom Tov outside of Israel for Sukkot and Pesach. Kishnei Yom Tovim Shel Shoshana L'Rabbanon Desharu. He would treat the 2 days of Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz like the Chachamim treated the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, even in Eretz Yisrael, that you would have to, that you can have the Sveika Diyoma. Right? Meaning, whereas Rabbi Yossi was Machmir when it came to Rosh Hashanah, because you have to assume that maybe both days are Mamish Kodesh. However, the Chacham were more makel. They said, look, it's a Sveika Diyoma. So maybe what the Brisa is saying is that even though Rabbi Yossi was Machmir when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, but by all of the other holidays, he would agree and say, like the Chachamim say, that it can be a Sveika Diyoma and 1 day is Kodesh and 1 day is Chol. Ashkeche Rav Sheshes l'Rabba Bar Shmuel. Now, Rav Sheshes found Rabba Bar Shmuel Amarle, and he said to Rabba Bar Shmuel, Tani Marmidi B'Kedushas, did you learn anything about when it comes to the Kedusha of the 2 days of Yom Tiv? Amarle Tanina Moder Rabbi Yossi B'Shnei Yom Tovim Shel Galios. And Rabba Bar Shmuel said to Rav Sheshes that yes, I learned that Rabbi Yossi admits that when it comes to the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galios, when it comes to the 2 days of Yom Tiv on Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, that he admits to the Chachamim that it's 1 day is going to be Kodesh, 1 day is going to be Chol. We don't treat it as both days Kodesh. To which Amarle Rav Sheshes says to Rabbi Bar Shmuel, if you find Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda and the Reish Galusa, don't tell them this Brisa. That's going to get me into trouble. The interesting thing is that we had this same exact thing on Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, where also with Rav Nachman at the Reish Galusa, it had to do with the Tzuras HaPesach. That the question was, do the walls of the Tzuras HaPesach have to go all the way up to, or do the beams have to go all the way up to the crossbeam? So Rav Nachman said no. Rav Sheshes said yes. Rav Nachman constructed a Tzuras HaPesach for the Reish Galusa where the sides did not go up to the crossbeam. And Rav Sheshes had his assistant Rav Gada dismantle it. Rav Gada was thrown in jail, and then Rav Sheshes gets him out of jail, and then he finds Rabbi Bar Shmuel, and he says, have you learned anything about Tzuras HaPesach? And he basically says, like Rav Nachman's teaching. To which Rav Sheshes says, wow, if you see any of those guys, don't tell them this Brisa. So you see the same thing over here also with the Reish Galusa. Rav Sheshes sort of getting into trouble, and then being proved wrong and asking not to share that he's wrong. Alright. Amar Rav Ashi said, Rav Ashi, L'didi Amar li Ameimar, that Ameimar said to me, Hau bar tavi lab it tzude it tzid ela michutz l'tchum asa. So Rav Ashi said that actually this deer was not trapped on day 1 and then they shechted on day 2. No, that's not what it's talking about. It all happened, let's say, on day 2. And what it was that this animal was brought michutz l'tchum. That maybe these non-Jewish deer people, they brought in a deer for the Reish Galusa from outside of the Tchum Shabbos. So now the question is, man da'acha, so Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, who ate the meat, that if this deer was brought for, let's say, Ruvain, from outside of the Tchum, so Ruvain can't eat it, because it was brought from outside of the Tchum, he can't eat it. But Shimon can eat it, because it wasn't brought for him. So therefore, Rav Nachman and Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda figured, well, this deer wasn't brought for us, it was brought for the Reish Galusa, so therefore we can eat it. Whereas Rav Sheshes held, Savar kol de asi levereish galusa daita d'chul rabbanon asi. That Rav Sheshes felt that anything that's brought for the Reish Galusa was really, the assumption is it's brought for all the rabbis. Therefore it was brought for us too from outside of the Tchum, therefore we cannot eat it. Okay? V'ha ashkechei Rav Sheshes the Rabbi Bar Shmuel v'amalei v'chulei. But what about, how could it be talking about where an animal came from chutz l'tchum? What about the whole thing with Rav Sheshes and from Rabbi Bar Shmuel? He said, teach me something about whether Yom Tov Sheni Shogalios is kilu 2 kedushos or 1 kedusha, right? That whole thing. And Rabbi Bar Shmuel responded that it's 2 kedushos, and he said, don't tell anybody. What does that have to do with tchum? So lo hayu dvar me'olam. So Rashi says, oh yeah, that never happened. Okay, interesting. All right. Very nice. Alright, friends, well, that was Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Ayruvin. Hope you enjoyed that. Let us review a little bit of what we talked about at the beginning. We just wrapped up the discussion of Rav's opinion regarding when you have Yom Tov followed by Shabbos, right? Rav said that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, and we just kind of wrapped up that discussion in terms of how does a chana fit into things. Okay, Seder. Then we got into a new Mishnah where we talked about 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. And essentially, really, there was a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi. That the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda is together with the Chachamim. So their opinion is, look, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, we view it as 2 separate days. One of them is going to be a weekday. One of them is going to be Rosh Hashanah. We're not really sure which one is which. So we keep 2 days. However, you can view them as 2 Kedushos, and you can make 2 Ayruvin, things like that. Now, Rabbi Yossi says no. Interestingly, Rabbi Yossi says that you could actually have a situation where Bezdin says that there's mamish 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. It's not just a suffix. If the witnesses come to testify about the moon after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim was already offered, the Bezdin are going to say, okay, mamish, both days are actually going to be Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, out of concern that maybe it's a year where both days are mamish Rosh Hashanah, so then he says that you have to treat it as 1 Kedusha. And then the question becomes, what does Rabbi Yossi say about other Yom Tovs that we keep in Chutz La'aretz 2 days, but they aren't Rosh Hashanah? So, first we had a brisa which implied that Rabbi Yossi would maintain also that by other Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galius, you would view it as 1 Kedusha for some reason. But then we essentially then gave different reasons from Rava, from Rav Asi, from Rabbi Bar Shmuel, to show that Rabbi Yossi actually would say that when it comes to other holidays, other than Rosh Hashanah, he would agree that 1 day is going to be Kodesh, 1 day is going to be Chol, and you can view them as Beis Kedushos. Alright, friends, that was Daf Lamed Tes. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.